Welcome back, boxing fans, to another great day of boxing. Obviously, we had a great card last night. Junto Nakatani won his third weight division by beating Santiago, the same fighter who previously had beaten Donaire for that vacant WBC title. Inui's brother, Takumi the Ghost Inui, as I dub him, scored a sensational knockout, which is unusual for him. He is not the brother with power. Landed a great body shot to the liver, stopping his opponent to defend his title, Jerwin Ancanjas, the 115-pound IBF world champion. And of course, the other fighter on the card was who? Yoshi Tanaka, who became a four-weight world champion by winning a vacant title that, of course, Junto Nakatani had previously gave up to move up in weight. Today, we had Edgar Berlanga, who is trying to showcase himself for a possible matchup for Canelo Alvarez. And that's why we're here today, as you can tell by the title. Excuse me for my runny, snotty nose. I think allergies. I will try to stop. So let's get to it. Edgar Berlanga came out in the first three rounds and was very inactive. The crowd was getting a little hostile, booing him. His team was getting a little concerned just based on his performance or lack thereof. In the fourth round, he came out and started to become a little more aggressive, started to land some shots. And from that point forward, he took over the fight through the fourth, fifth, and finally in the sixth round when he ended up stopping his Irish opponent with, a stunning knockout, which for him was even more important because this was a man who had 16 first-round knockouts, and then once he stepped up his level of competition, ended up having a run of 5 unanimous decisions against higher-level competition. Paddy McCrory was obviously put in there to give him exactly what he needed, a knockout victory, and that's exactly what happened. I felt it was funny listening to DAZN afterwards when they're acting like this victory somehow catapulted Berlanga into the conversation for a potential Canelo Alvarez fight. There's quite a few different angles we can take with regards to this. Obviously, currently, Canelo Alvarez is part of the PBC, signed a 3-fight deal with the PBC, has one of those fights out of way, which means he still has 2 more fights under contract with the PBC, which is why most of us that think about potential opponents for Canelo Alvarez think about in-house PBC opponents. Maybe a Bud Crawford, maybe a Charlo, maybe a Benavidez, right? And with those 3 opponents, any of those 2 would be perfect opponents for that May and September date. But of course, we're not sure what's going to happen. He came out, Canelo himself, and said he's going to be fighting an American, which means that all 3 of these fighters are in contention because all 3 of them are Americans. Of course, there's other fighters who people are talking about as potential opponents, such as Jaime Munguia, who is a Golden Boy DAZN fighter, and obviously had a sensational performance in his last fight, catapulting himself right into the conversation as a potential Canelo Alvarez fight opponent by beating and stopping John Ryder, the same John Ryder that Canelo Alvarez had previously fought and was unable to knock out. Jaime Munguia did what Canelo couldn't do, and that is a sensational statement. Not just that, but he's also a very fan-friendly style, a guy who gets hit as much as he hits, which means that his vulnerability makes his fights that much more entertaining. Whether he's winning or losing a fight, it's always fun because you never know how things are going to turn out. His Derevchenko fight was potentially a fight of the year candidate. And obviously his fight with John Ryder was equally sensational up until the stoppage victory. Berlanga was trying to walk in Jaime Munguia's footsteps, right? He was trying to do what Jaime Munguia had done, except he was doing it against a far lesser opponent. Paddy McCrory is an Irish fighter who literally hasn't done anything in boxing, unlike John Ryder, who's been in world title fights, has beat top level competition, has fought multiple top 10 ranked 168-pound fighters, and has victories against top 10 168-pound opponents. Whereas this Irish opponent has never fought anybody who you could even say was probably ranked in the top 20, right? So trying to act as if what Berlanga did is equal to what Munguia did, first of all, is ridiculous. Tizone and Moro, Sergio Moro, came out and acted like this justifies the Canelo Alvarez fight, this sensational performance. But in my eyes, it doesn't do anything like that. It just shows us exactly what we know. He's limited, and there's a whole skew of potential opponents at 168 pounds that could all beat his ass. And let's get into that. I already did this in my live earlier today. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I know it's a live of the fight. If you've already seen it, then maybe it's redundant, but here we are right now. So we look at these rankings currently, and obviously Canelo Alvarez, it's just to get a sense of what's going on in the 168-pound division. So as you can see in the screen somewhere, you can see the WBC rankings, where obviously Canelo is the champion. David Benavidez is currently the interim champion. Jaime Munguia and Christian Mbila are the number 1 and number 2 ranked opponents. Eric Bazinian, number 3. Diego Pacheco, 4. Caleb Plant, number 5. That's a solid top 5. The one person in that ranking who people may believe doesn't belong is the Canadian fighter, who hasn't really had the same level of competition yet. Then we look at the WBA, and this is the interesting point. By beating McCrory, Berlanga has just elevated himself into the mandatory position for Canelo Alvarez fight, and that's going to be the justification. He's a mandatory. But the interesting thing about the WBC rankings is that you have a regular champion in David Morrell. Why would a mandatory opponent supersede a regular champion like David Morrell, who's been paying sanctioning fees? Specifically, when the WBA talked about combining their titles and no longer having 2 separate champions, but combining it into one. Why would David Morrell be surpassed by Berlanga? I know Berlanga may have more marketability than Morrell. So my fix would be have Berlanga face Morrell, and the winner of that fight then it becomes the mandatory fight for Canelo Alvarez. Morrell deserves an opportunity as much as, if not more so, than Berlanga. He was at the fight tonight. You know, he's got everything boxing fans like. He looks the part, good-looking kid, obviously comes from the Cuban school of boxing, but lives and resides in the U.S., obviously trying to build a fan base in the central north area of the States in Minnesota, eh? So speed, power, sensational knockout victories, has fought just as good level of competition as Berlanga, and really looked far more dominant in the process, right? Currently, Mbila, who's just coming off of a sensational victory as well in himself, is ranked number 1. Eric Bazinian was 2. McCrory was number 3. Based on number 8 ranked Berlanga beating McCrory, all of a sudden now he jumps ahead of Christian Mbila. So right there, once again, you have Morrell and you have Mbila. Just like for the WBC, you have Munguia and Mbila. So there are legitimate opponents that should be ranked ahead of Berlanga. Berlanga is not coming off the kind of victory that really justifies him being a mandatory or him even being in the number 1 position by a sanctioning body, right? And then, of course, you have the IBF, where they have William Skull as the number 1 and Vladimir Shishkin number 2, Christian Mbila number 3, Diego Pacheco number 4, Eric Bazinian number 5, Berlanga number 6. IBF rankings like the WBA tend to be fucking terrible. And this is just another example. William Skull, does not deserve, just like Vladimir Shishkin over Bimbila or Diego Pacheco. I think a Pacheco or Bimbila would destroy those fighters, right? And are guys that should get attention. Uh, Pacheco is also a DAZN fighter, part of Golden Boy, also has coming off of sensational knockout victories. Bimbila coming off of sensational knockout victories, right? You throw Berlanga, Manguia. You have four young up-and-coming fighters, all coming off of sensational victories, as well as Morel, the PBC champion. That's five young up-and-coming fighters who all potentially could be in the Canelo Alvarez sweepstakes, right? So to act like Berlanga should get that opportunity, I don't get it. Because out of all of them, he's probably the weakest link. And, you know, in truth, we know if Canelo does sign to fight Berlanga, it's not going to go over very well, right? So it's just not going to really make as much money as they think it potentially could, unlike a Jaime Munguia fight. Or if Berlanga was to beat any of these other top young fighters I just mentioned, whether it's a Mbila, which would be a fucking great matchup, or a Pacheco, another great matchup, or a David Morrell, another great matchup, right? If you throw him in with either one of those three fighters and he beats them, then I would have no problem pushing him right up there for a potential Canelo Alvarez fight. This is the same as when guys like Charlo and Andrade were there. And I said, sure, you beat each other, and then you deserve the opportunity to face Canelo Alvarez in the big money fight. It's the same with these guys, right? Make a matchup with some of these guys who have put in the work and deserve an opportunity just as much, if not more. Then we look at the WBO rankings. They have Munguia number 1, Pacheco number 2, Bazinian number 3. Eric Bazinian, right? He's right up there. Any of these guys should jump at the chance to fight him. He's highly ranked, but outside of having some power and some amateur pedigree, he seems definitely to be the weakest link out of all of them. Mimbila at number 4, Berlanga at number 5, right? Once again, Berlanga. The rankings really tell you where he belongs. And if we talk about him matching up with any of these young fighters, you know exactly why they want to rush and steamroll him right to the front of the line for a Canelo Alvarez big money fight, right? Obviously, for Eddie Hearn and Matchroom, they pocket the money for this. They get back into promotion of Canelo Alvarez. It's a perfect situation for them. Munguia is Golden Boy, so they're sort of outside of that. But for them, if they got Berlanga involved, it's a money situation. Whether he wins or loses doesn't matter. They also work again with Canelo Alvarez, which continues to have good relationships between them and him. And when he finishes this 3-fight deal, obviously with the PBC, then he would be more likely to come back to Matchroom and DAZN, right? That's why I think this fight right now is very unlikely to happen in 2024 unless it happens late in 2024, November or December. Because I think these two PBC fights are definitely going to be PBC fighters. And then after that, Canelo Alvarez then potentially could move back to DAZN and take on a Berlanga, right? In his first fight, re-signing with them. And at that point, coming off of those fights, people wouldn't have too much negative to say. If you face David Benavidez in September and whoever you're going to fight in May, and retain your titles, and then cross back over to DAZN with Matchroom and take on Berlanga, then people would be like, well, you did what you're supposed to do. You fought against Benavidez, right? So now to re-sign with DAZN, Matchroom, and take on this opponent who's pretty much easy work, but is marketable, that makes sense. Everybody would understand the reasoning behind it. But at this point, stop. Come on. Stop. Nobody's going to be okay with this fight at this present moment. If you look at this picture that DAZN put on as potential opponents for Canelo's next 2 fights, they have, of course, Charlo, and then they have Munguia, Berlanga, and Terence Crawford. It's no surprise DAZN is pushing two fighters that are presently on the DAZN side, right? Because of course they hope that Canelo Alvarez once again works with DAZN because that is beneficial for DAZN. But the most likely opponent would be a Charlo or a Crawford. And it's interesting that they don't have Benavidez on this, right? Because he should be the main guy. And to be fair, Chris Maddox did say that, yes, we all agree that the guy who deserves the fight next is David Benavidez. So I guess these are the four opponents, not David Benavidez, who potentially are in the sweepstakes for the fight. But, you know, and of course, you notice Morrell's not there. And it's true. I mean, I understand Morrell is maybe high risk, low reward. And that's probably the reason why he's not being mentioned in that group. And also, it is DAZN, and Morrell is a PBC fighter, so they're not going to necessarily mention an up and coming young PBC fighter that they're not attached with. But for me, if I was a sanctioning body like the WBA, I wouldn't be acting as if Berlanga is the mandatory opponent from the WBA for a Canelo Alvarez fight. I would say that if you want that mandatory fight, you can fight Christian Mbilla or you can fight David Morrell. If you beat one of them, you will become our mandatory opponent for Canelo Alvarez, and we'll push that this year. And at that point, I think nobody would be negative towards it at all because those two fights are great. And I think in truth, most people would favor Mbili or Morrell to beat Berlanga. So if Berlanga was able to beat one of them, that would be a huge statement. Probably, definitely the biggest statement of his career, and definitely justification for him to get a fight like a Canelo Alvarez, right? You know, I think all these fighters, if we're being completely honest, would potentially beat him. So let's do the list. I already basically gave you a good indication of who I think would beat him, but let's just break it down here right now. So fighters at 168 that I feel would beat, destroy, humiliate, and retire Berlanga. Obviously, Canelo. I don't think that fight's competitive. I think Canelo kills him. Benavidez kills him. Jaime Munguia, I think it's an entertaining fight for as long as it lasts. Munguia beats him. Derevchenko is far smaller. So I can see him beating Derevchenko, but I think it would be a dog fight that would go to the decision. Christian Mbilla, I think, beats the crap out of him. I don't think he can deal with Christian Mbilla's work rate and power and aggressiveness. In the first 3 rounds today, he barely even threw a punch. If he did that with Mbilla, Mbilla would beat the crap out of him in the first 3 rounds. Caleb Plant outboxes him, embarrasses him. Andrade is no longer at this weight, so we'll skip over him. David Morrell, I think David Morrell knocks him out inside 6 rounds. His speed, his power, way too much. Berlanga is slow foot, slow hands, right? All he relies on is power. Then we jump down a few. We got Sishkin, Iglesias, who are both there. Potentially, I think maybe he could beat those guys. He's number 11. And then you get Bek Melikuziev. I think Bek Melikuziev against Berlanga is a great matchup. If I was DAZN, that's a fight I would push because that would be an entertaining fight. I mean, Beck already got stopped by Rosado, but Rosado is a much better technical fighter with far more experience and a far better resume than Berlanga. Not the natural 168-pounder, but I just think he's a much better all-around fighter. I think Bek Melikuziev Berlanga would be a war that could go either way. True 50-50 fight. Diego Pacheco at number 13. Come on, man. Diego Pacheco, this dude there, 20-0 with 17 KOs. The kid is 22 years of age. 22. He's one of the least hyped up fighters in boxing, an American, right? People are talking about all these other American fighters. They don't talk about this kid. He's coming off of a victory over Corseses, who went the distance with Berlanga. He knocked that guy out in 9 rounds, beat the piss out of him. right? Already at 22 years of age, he's been far more dominant against the same level of opponents. And his next opponent, he's facing an undefeated fighter in Sean McCalman, who is 15 and 0. I don't know who that is. Black American guy, 7 knockouts, 30 years of age, out of Colorado. So apparently he can't be that good. When we look at who he's faced, one of his biggest wins, yeah, this kid is definitely not at that level. This is just a stay busy fight. He's literally been in only 8-round fights for his whole career. He did beat Vaughn Alexander in a 6-rounder. He beat Money Powell in an 8-rounder. Two guys that American boxing fans are very familiar with. So he beat the guys that, are there to be beaten. Now Diego Pacheco is going to destroy him, right? I think Pacheco kills Berlanga. I don't even think it's competitive. Bazinian, that could be a win fight for him to win. Anything outside of Berlanga, now you're getting into the top 14, into the top 20. I think those fighters he potentially could win. The one guy who I think could beat him is tough French fighter Kevin Saio, who's 21 and 0 with 19 KOs. I think he would beat Berlanga, right? And obviously, the level of competition he's been in with is not that high. But I just think his pressure, his power, his aggressiveness, I don't think Berlanga can deal with it, right? I think all these guys would beat the piss out of Berlanga. I think Berlanga is a diva who thinks that he's a hip hop superstar. He doesn't do what he has to do in the gym to be prepared for the level of opponents he should be fighting. Today's opponent was a cherry pick, and people act like somehow this justifies a Canelo Alvarez fight. To me, this justifies nothing. And I would be very disappointed if Canelo Alvarez fights this kid in 2024, unless he was to beat a Morel or a Mbilla or a Pacheco or a Munguia. If you beat one of those fighters, then okay. Then everything I say is taken back, and I apologize because obviously he's far better than I expected. But up until that happens, man, hype job, overrated. I don't want to see him against Canelo because that fight is a waste of my time and a waste of your time. But let me know what you think. Leave it in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Peace out. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you next time. Later.